I see anything related to nuclear power, it always fascinates me. When you hunt about nuclear energy, reactors and all that, one case you will definitely come across is the Chernobyl nuclear disaster. Most of you might have heard of it from the TV series, right? I mean the Chernobyl series. For those who don't, well, I'm here. So on April 26, 1986, probably one of the most unfortunate and unforgettable day, a sudden surge of power during an ongoing test of the system destroyed the Unit 4 of nuclear power station Chernobyl at Ukraine with a massive explosion. Bursting the core of the reactor open, the resulting steam explosion and fires released at least 5% of the radioactive core into the environment, with the deposition of radioactive materials in many parts of the Europe. 5% may not seem like much, right? Well, to put that into perspective, the reactor had like 192,000 kilograms of nuclear fuel. To understand completely what happened at Chernobyl, let's first have a glance on how nuclear reactors work. So a typical nuclear reactor uses nuclear fission of nuclear fuel as fuel rods, which contain specifically radioactive isotopes of heavy elements like uranium-235, which is unstable. By bombardment with neutrons, it simply splits into relatively stable atoms by releasing an enormous amount of energy and neutrons. The reaction of uranium-235 can be written as: the neutrons which is emitted is used to catalyze other fuel rods to increase the reactivity when required, and the energy which is released is used to heat the water to steam, which then goes to the turbine to generate electricity. So let me summarize what's going on inside the reactor. There are these fuel rods inserted inside the core of the reactor containing nuclear fuel, which also has water. Water has two important functions. Number one, it absorbs the heat and generates steam, which is used to produce electricity in the turbine, thus acting as a coolant as well. Number two, it acts as a neutron absorbent, which is really important because when we talk about nuclear reactions, we really need to control these reactions, as the results could be detrimental. The nuclear reactor also has quite a lot of control rods, which are made up of these elements like hafnium or boron, which also basically absorbs neutrons. So you do understand how important it is to control the reaction, right? Coming back to Chernobyl, the nuclear power plant has a so-called RBMK reactor. The test of the nuclear reactor was to check the functioning of the reactor at low power, but what turned out to be catastrophic was that the test was conducted with almost all of its emergency systems turned off, and not only this, the personnel on duty that night really lacked professional training.
What did you do? I did what you said, I switched. Look at it!
I don't understand.
But the greed of getting a successful test results pushed them to go beyond the limits. And not even this was enough. The control rods that day was reduced from 30 to as low as 6. The reactor those days has something which is considered these days a major flaw, a positive void coefficient. Remember the diagram of the reactor I showed you earlier? Let's consider by any chance there is a surge of power and there is a very good possibility that the stream is generated inside the core of the reactor just next to the fuel rods as voids, and the steam is not really as good as water in absorbing neutrons and cooling. As a result, the neutrons gets well exposed to the other fuel rods, increasing the reactivity in an enormous amount, which then again creates more voids, more heat, more neutron, more voids, forming a chain that increases the reactivity at enormous amount unchecked. It creates a positive feedback loop that just throws everything out of control. That's exactly what happened at Unit 4 at the Chernobyl nuclear reactor at 1:23 a.m. on that day. During this low power test, this loop of heat and steam that was generated, the reactor power of Unit 4 increased to well over 12,000%. This heat that was generated inside the core evaporated all the water and created an extreme pressure that blasted out, removing the top shield of the reactor, which weighed over 1,000,000 kilograms, the equivalent weight of about 25 war tanks. After another explosion, the air rushed into the reactor, which set the graphite on fire, which led to the release of roughly 8 tons of radioactive contaminants into the air. It also increased the temperature of the core about half the temperature of the sun, about 2000 degrees Celsius. This was a massive meltdown, which also started to glow incandescently. Many attempts were made to extinguish the fire by firefighters by pouring 5 million kilograms of sand and clay and other materials through helicopters, but fire was almost impossible to extinguish. Many firefighters died soon after that, absorbing lethal doses of radiation that they carried was being constantly released with smoke and fire. It took 9 long days of constantly pouring sand and clay to extinguish the fire. The fire was extinguished, but the bottom of the Unit 4 was still hot and burning. The radioactive lava. It was eating everything that came in its way to the earth. It totally ate the bottom shield and then 2 meters of concrete, reaching the basement section of Chernobyl. Thousands of kilograms of sand, silicate, glass, molten metal was all flowing with absolutely cataclysmic corium, and underneath that, Unit 4, it was forming an unnatural and terrifying stalactites and stalagmites. When the nuclear inspectors were sent in and they captured a picture and came back up, the scientists called it the elephant's foot, and it's still eating its way to the earth. The accident caused the largest uncontrolled radioactive release into the environment ever recorded. Large quantities of radioactive substances were released in the air for about 10 days, which included short-lived iodine-131 and the long-lived cesium-137. At least 5% of the remaining radioactive material in the reactor core was released in the accident. Most of the material was deposited close by dust and debris, but the lighter material were carried by the wind over Ukraine, Belarus, Russia, and some other extent of Scandinavia and Europe. The radiation dose.
Но не всегда острая лучевая болезнь так легко протекает.
Вот, Володя, я тебя хочу расспросить, как все дело было, вот как ты получил травму?
Глухой взрыв слышал.
The radiation doses on the first day caused 28 deaths, 6 of which were firemen. The doses received by the firefighters and the power plant workers were high enough to result into an acute radiation syndrome, which occurs if a person is exposed to more than 700 milligrams of radiation within a short time frame, usually minutes. Common ADIOS symptoms include gastrointestinal problems, example nausea and vomiting, headaches, burns, and fever. Whole body doses between 4,000 milligrams and 5,000 milligrams within short time frame would kill 50% of those exposed, and with 8,000 to 10,000 milligrams is universally fatal. The doses received by the firefighters who died were estimated to range up to 20,000 milligrams. The plant operator's town of Pripyat was evacuated on 27th April, about 45,000 residents. By 14th May, some 116,000 people had been living with a 30-kilometer radius, having evacuated and later relocated. About 1,000 of these returned unofficially to live in the contaminated zone. Most of those evacuated received radiations of less than 50 microsieverts, although a few received 100 microsieverts or more.
Помер після аварії, був ліквідатором теж. А жили ми потім на Прип'яті. Покинули батьківську хату, поїхали на Прип'ять жити, там квартиру дадуть. Бо у нас же діти, треба ж, щоб при городі десь були. Ну і ми там прожили 15 років, поки существувала та Прип'ять. І в ніч я працювала на скорій помощі, фельдшерської допомоги.
For now, the whole exclusion zone is pretty contaminated and will remain uninhabitable for about 5 to 6 centuries. But plants have undergone certain mutations and are doing pretty well. There's literally a lot more than this to talk about Chernobyl, but it's not really possible to summarize all of them in a single video, so I'm going to sign off for today. See you on the next one. Until then, keep it real.
Bye.